All right, I think we are live everywhere. So, welcome, guys. Today is a very interesting class where we'll talk about facial muscles. There's a few housekeeping points I want to go through before we get started with that. First of all, I want to welcome everyone who is on stream and who is here for the first time. I see, and I've certainly heard some new voices there that I haven't heard before, so welcome. It's good to see the community grow like that on a weekly basis. So, welcome, guys. If this is your first stream. I'm certainly glad that you are here joining us today. I got a whole lot of stuff here that I have already prepared and that we will simply spend the course to go through and to look at in every great detail. Since it's hard to talk about facial muscles if we don't also talk about the impact that these muscles have as far as facial expressions are concerned. So I am super excited to go through all of these. So all of these come from 3D Scan Store. I mean, like, had I bought a commercial licenses for all these things, I think it would have cost me like over like $7,000 or something. So they were quite gracious and lending me some of these cans so that we can use them for the class today. So I super appreciate that, guys, from 3D Scan Store. Thanks a lot for those scans, and don't be afraid to go and support them if ever there's some scans in here that you think are really, really interesting. Three things. First of all, on outgang.studio, I'm super happy to announce that we have finally added informative chapters to each class that we have. Let me just show this to you guys. I'm super proud of that. If I click on one of these classes, let's open the cloth and fold anatomy, one of the most popular ones that we have. You guys can see here that now we have all the chapters that are on display here. And so you can actually click on these and this will take you directly to the part of the class that is related to that. So this should help you guys to have an idea of what is within each class. So I'm super happy with that. What else do we have? We now have a Twitter account. You guys can follow us at #Outgang3D. We'll probably change it to, I'm not sure that handle will stay that way forever, but for now that's what it is. So that's where to follow us on Twitter. I do want to give you guys a bit of a warning. We will look at a lot of dissection pictures. That will happen. I got a whole lot of stuff to show you guys as far as that's concerned. I won't give you guys a warning before I put the pictures on screen because I think we'll simply be organically going through each of the pictures that I have prepared. And, I would probably forget at some point to let you guys know that there's one that's coming up there. So I would rather just make you guys aware there's some dried cadavers in here that I will put on stream from time to time. So we'll talk about, first we'll talk about the muscles that are attached to the jaw, really, so the mastication muscles. We could also call those the skeletal muscles because they more or less all connect to the skeleton. We'll start with those. Then we'll talk about the muscles of the neck. All right. So just like for the skull, let's start with mostly the temporal plane, so the plane on the side of the face there. But so last class, we had that class where we talked about everything that had to do with facial anatomy as it relates to the skull. And we have talked quite a lot about the temporalis a little bit and the relation between the temporalis muscle and the skull there. And we have talked a little bit about the shape of it. We've certainly broke it down in certain details so far, but I want to spend more time to look at temporalis and everything that has to do with the temporal plane, because there is more than temporalis, which is interesting to know about. Now, temporalis really is the biggest muscle when it comes to the temporal plane, of course, because that's where it gets its name, but there are other muscles on top of that that don't necessarily create a lot of surface shape, but they do appear once in a while depending on the kind of expression that you do, or if you contract the right muscle, we'll start to see other bumps that get created there. So yeah, so far, essentially, what we have defined as far as temporalis was concerned was the fact that, of course, the muscle attaches to the temporal plane of the skull, and it is essentially a muscle that has this kind of tubular appearance, sort of, because the middle section here is made out of tendon mostly, and so you don't get to see it too much. It doesn't really have a lot of volume. Now, which is not to say that the skin is resting flat on top of that. There is actually other stuff on top of it. there's fat, there's other muscles on top of it. But for the most part, temporalis does not have much volume as far as the middle of it is concerned, really. And so here's an image where the jaw was actually projected forward. So in this particular case, on this particular scan, the jaw is actually projected forward, which has the impact of stretching temporalis to its maximum. So in this case here, now this particular man has a temporalis that is actually quite furnished, I suppose. Should probably not draw it that much because there is something else here, but for the most part, you know, there is, even with the jaw projected forward, quite a lot of roundness here. So this man certainly has some very, very, very prominent temporalis. And take a look at this. Take a look at this particular image as opposed to this one here. See if I do the back and forth here. Now, on this case here, on this second picture, the jaw is now clenched. It is clenched as opposed to being extended. So now we get really the full body of temporalis that is visible here because it is essentially active right now. And you guys can see just the kind of shape that it has. It has this weird shape here that simply makes its way down and that crosses on the inside of the zygomatic arch there. So we have this huge mass here that kind of appear, and we can clearly see where the tendon is really. You know, it's this kind of zone here, and it would probably extend a bit further back, but because of the angle of the camera, it's kind of hard to see there. So we have this kind of shape to temporalis. It's a very interesting muscle. Let me go ahead here and jump to ZBrush, and we can take a look at it here. Yeah, so you can see here, like, there's some really interesting stuff here. First of all, one thing I would like you guys to explore or to observe, we haven't really talked about this last week, but I think it's really interesting to observe it, really. If you take a look here at the skull, let's say to go back to the skull here. So let's go back here. In fact, I have another skull here. I think it's the same one, but I'll just use this one here instead for now. By the way, it's something that I had not observed before, but now that I have, but having observed it, it just felt like something kind of obvious to me, and I thought it was interesting to just point it out to you guys, really. So the outer border of the orbit of the eye here, there is this really nice alignment between the outer border of the orbit of the eye and where the temporal line starts. You guys can see here, you can see that really nice alignment right here. And that's actually true as much for the female skull as it is for the male skull. So this is the female skull. We just plot where the border of the orbit of the eye is. You guys can see how nicely aligned these two lines are. So this really helps. Observing this really helps to really kind of understand where the temporal line is, because some of these bumps here on the side of the face can start to get really confusing a little bit, you know? Like, we know that temporalis is this kind of tubular muscle that kind of runs on the side here. You know, but is it this tube here or is it this tube there? You know, like, which one is it really? You know, it's kind of hard to judge just based off of that here. But if we look for the border of the eye here, and I draw this vertical line from there, it actually becomes very, very obvious where the temporal line is right now. So you can see that we have the temporal line here. Now, in this case here, the temporal line is actually receded. Let me see if I can get an angle here that would allow us to look at this a bit better. We can see here how there's actually a bit of a shadow here at the temporal line. So we have temporalis that is right here. And then we can see that the temporal line is kind of creating this kind of valley or this kind of depression on the skin there. And that doesn't happen on everyone. That simply depends on how muscular temporalis actually is. Because if we go through some of these scans and we look at faces that are a bit more lean, I suppose, for temporalis, you can see that now temporalis is starting to be flat. And although we still have that kind of groove there, you know, like we're starting to see more and more a line that protrudes out that is created by the temporal line. But so that's kind of interesting to spot, you know, like based off of how prominent temporalis is, you may or may not see the temporal line. That's very, very visible. You know, here it's practically invisible. But as you know, we can still deduce that this is temporalis. simply by looking at where the eye is here, right? So we know that our temporal line is about here, so temporalis would still be here. And certainly if we go through these different scans, you can see how, depending on how the jaw is contracted, I suppose, we can start to really see this kind of tube of temporalis that starts to appear or not. But yeah, so depending how muscular temporalis is, you may or may not be in a situation where you can easily spot where its upper border is, really. Now, of course, if you have a scan like this that doesn't have long hair, then it's usually easier to spot really the shape of everything that we have. And yeah, like, take a look at this. Like we can really see like the size of temporalis. You know, like we can really kind of clearly make out here the back border of it. See, there's this kind of groove here that's kind of starting from the ear and is kind of going diagonally across and towards the top there. So we can really spot the whole mass of temporalis. Now, as I said, there's more to it than temporalis in there. There are also muscles that help to move the ear around that have a very slight volume to them. It's not very big, but we'll see a few examples where that's actually kind of obvious that the muscles are there, really. And as we go through the different expressions here and we take a look here at temporalis, we'll be able to spot differences in how, in its particular shape. Take a look at this here. Now, this isn't actually temporalis at this point. This is actually something else. I'll come back to that in a few minutes there, but we can clearly see that depending on how temporalis is contracted or not, like here when there is the, this is called neck tighten as an expression. And I assume that as he was tightening his neck, he also was clenching his jaw a little bit. So yeah, take a look at the volume here. You know, like when temporalis is activated, take a look at this muscle right here. And we can see a little bit here of the kind of expansion, I suppose, or just a little tail that kind of runs down on the side of the orbit of the eye there that also kind of protrudes out, you know. So if you are sculpting facial expressions, this is definitely a muscle that you want to pay attention to, especially if the jaw is either open or if the jaw is kind of clenching. You will have a different look to temporalis. And I'm not sure if we can see any changes here on the back. Let's go through these. Yeah, you can see how this line also kind of moves around. Now, as I said, there's more here and there. There's actually other muscles that also have a bit of an impact. And we'll come back to those in just a few minutes from now. But we can really appreciate that there really is a cavity here that gets created because of the tendinous zone of temporalis. Now, the question is, like, why don't we always have this kind of cavity that is as obvious you know, when the face is at rest there? And you know, like I would say that we can see a cavity here just a little bit on the side, but the reason for that is because we have like that cavity. There's often some fat that also gets inserted within that particular cavity right there, and therefore the fat does help to kind of make the plane a bit more planar there. So we don't necessarily see as much of a cavity when the head is at rest. Although someone who would have very prominent temporalis and a very small amount of facial fat would certainly start to see a cavity there that would certainly form. Now, unfortunately, on most of these female heads, they have a little hat to hold the hair back, and they have long hair, so it makes it a bit harder to really be able to really appreciate what happens to temporalis as the jaw moves around there. You move this on the side there. But we can clearly see once more how temporalis changes. See this huge cavity here? That's because her jaw is actually open. And because her jaw is open, it simply stretches temporalis, since temporalis is a muscle that helps to close the jaw as opposed to open the jaw, of course. And therefore, when you open the jaw like that, it has a tendency to stretch the muscle and to make the body of the muscle a lot smaller there. But yeah, so that's kind of interesting that we can really spot the whole shape of temporalis all the way from the front to the back of the head when we have a head that is doesn't have a lot of hair, really. We can go through these other scans to see if there's anything interesting there. Let's see if there are Utter temporalis. Yeah, take a look at that, right? That's kind of what I was talking about before. Like, see the whole body of temporalis here? Like, this is that kind of combination that I was mentioning of like really highly developed temporalis and really low amount of fat in this particular zone here. So like we have fat here, you can kind of see a bump here. So this is actually the kind of like a piece of fat that sometimes extends a bit further up, sometimes not. But in this case here, we can see that the fat is a bit further down, so we really get the full cavity there that is created by the tendinous portion of temporalis. And I suspect that if we look at it from different angles, we'll probably also be able to spot the back border of temporalis a little bit there. Yeah, it's kind of hard to see. We don't really spot it too well, but we can definitely see that there's also a bit of a bump here. That would be the back of temporalis, or towards the back. So yeah, like it's actually crazy little muscle, right? There's a lot of variation there that you can kind of see on people. Here's a older gentleman that simply does not have a lot of very developed temporalis. So in this case, we start to really get a very, very flat zone right here. It's kind of interesting, right? There's a bit of a wrinkle here. That wrinkle is kind of interesting. And the reason why that is there is because we do have muscles that help to pull the ear around. So we have muscles that help to pull the ear around. I think I wanted to talk about masseter before we were talking about that, but I think actually, let's talk about those first. So there's a few bumps here that are kind of interesting to spot, really. There's a little bump here that you can see. And there's this wrinkle here that's very, very interesting as well. Let's go through our slides and let's talk more about these different bumps. Yeah, take a look at those, right? It's like, this is not a temporalis that we are looking at. There's clearly more stuff there that is happening. And so here, what is this here? So this is what we call occipitofrontalis, or just occipital muscle, if you will. And this is actually a little muscle that is connected to this huge fascia that connects the back here of the scalp with the muscle on the front that we call frontalis. So sometimes these two muscles are referred as the same one, which is how you get to the name occipitofrontalis. Occipital simply means on the back, and frontalis should pretty be obvious where that is related. But other people simply refer to this front portion as frontalis and this back portion as occipital. Which I think is a bit easier to understand. You know, you don't have to be like occipitofrontalis frontal part. You know, it's kind of a bit of a mouthful there. So I like to refer to these as well. But yeah, so take a look at this here. So essentially, these two muscles are combined to just move the scalp around and to help to contract it and to help in facial expressions and stuff like that. So there is this one here, but there is also like 6 other muscles. I believe it's 6. I'm not actually 100% sure of the count, but I believe it's 6. These other 6 muscles here that collectively called the auricular muscles. Now, as you can see, some of these have other names, but it's not really important to really know them in great detail. You just have to know that they're there, and you can simply call them all the auricular group, or the auricular muscles. So auricular muscles. And they simply help to move the ear around. Now, as humans, most of us don't have conscious control over our ears. We're not really able to move the ears around, but some people are a little bit. So these are mostly vestigial, but for some people, they are able to move their ears around either voluntarily or involuntarily. So those muscles are definitely there. And they do have a bit of an impact on shape, and they do have a bit of an impact on form, and sometimes you can actually see them contract under the right circumstances. And so that also helps to explain the fact that there's a bit of a bump here on the skull. You know, if you take a look at this here, you can see the kind of bump there, and you can see that the border of it matches nicely here with these two sections of the auricular muscles. We can see how the shape here is kind of compartmentalized here. And that combined with the fact that there's a nice wrinkle here, you know, like we don't get wrinkles on the face for nothing. We get wrinkles when we compress muscles over a long period of time, and, you know, just like a piece of paper that is bent too much at some point, and the surface will start to have a permanent mark there of the compression. So this explains why we start to have wrinkles that kind of form around the ear. You know, like you've probably seen older individuals to have kind of wrinkles in that zone here, and maybe have kind of wondered, like, why is it that we start to get like these kind of wrinkles and stuff like that around the ear? And that's the reason, essentially, because the ear does move around a little bit. So in this case here, we actually can see some relatively powerful auricular muscles there, but also on the back, see, there's a little bit of a bump there. And there's a little bit of a bump here. So this bump here is the bump that would correspond to the occipital muscle. And this would be simply another section of the auricular muscle. Now, this is a super heavy file, so I assume that this quick save will actually take a minute or so. So let's just let it finish. And while we look at other slides there. First dissection picture. No warning, just straight like that on the stream. Let's see who's let's see if people start to leave in droves from the chat. I don't think so. You're all still here. Y'all have a good stomach. I like that. Guess we got a whole lot more of these that are gonna come today. Yeah, occipital right here. This is the ear, of course. The ear has been simply pressed forward, I guess, or just not sure how to say that, but it's been put forward. So we have our occipital muscle here. Here we can see one of the auricular muscle right there. And take a look at this little thing right here. Take a look at this little thing right here. There's actually two little bellies to it. This here and this here, which is our posterior auricular muscle. Take a look at that. You know, so like, you could be like, yeah, you know, why do I care about that? It's kind of behind the ear. Well, you could care about it because you simply like to care about these things, which is my reason to care about most things, really, when I look at like facial anatomy. But there is a slight amount of shape that gets created here because of that. And here again, so we can see the body of one of the auricular muscles there. And I really love this particular. There's a scan here. There's one of these expressions. Just take a look at that. Let's go through the scans, and I invite you guys to look at the muscles of the ear and to really see how they just how they contract and simply activate. You'll see that it is anything but static. There's a few of these that are really beautiful. Take a look at this one here. Take a look at that. That's so crazy. I think that's the, what's that? That's tightening the neck. And like, you can see how the ear is actually moving, just not quite moving up, but it certainly is being pulled back a little bit, just a little bit, right? And take a look at that. We can see activation in the occipital muscle. We can see activation in the posterior auricular one. And we have all this mass here that also gets activated. We can clearly see here the front border of one of the auricular muscles. See this whole mass there? Yeah, that's crazy, right? That's like so cool. You wouldn't be able to catch that if you were just looking at 2D pictures for sure. But yeah, like all of these bumps, you know, it's like, okay, so the side of the skull really isn't just a flat plane, really, right? There's all these little bumps that get added on top there that we really want to try and capture if we are doing the most naturalistic portrait, I suppose, that we possibly can, you know? Yeah, see, like some of these scans, you can see how like all of these get slightly activated depending on the pose there. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. I love just little insights like these. So other than that, we have also the masseter. That is also very important to know, of course. So the masseter is this huge kind of bulbous shape here. It's very round, it's very thick. It is this huge, huge mass here that extends from the zygomatic arch and inserts at pretty much every point pretty much insert at every point down the ramus of the mandible. You know, so we have the ramus here. If I was to draw it, it would be this kind of shape like this here a little bit, kind of like that. And so there are fibers of masseter that insert at pretty much every point of the ramus there. So it is hugely powerful as a muscle, and it is, you know, another one of those that helps us to masticate and eat food. And what's interesting about masseter specifically is that you can see how so first of all, there's two portions to masseter that are good to know. There is the deep portion and there is the superficial portion. Now, separated, we would have here the superficial portion, of course, which is on top, which more or less goes in this direction. As you can see, maybe I should use a different color than this. That more or less goes in this direction here, just like that. And then we have the deeper portion of masseter, which, as you can guess, is under that, and kind of more or less goes straight down like this. And you can see here the little part of it that kind of sticks out there behind the superficial part. Now, you don't see the deep part too much, but in certain individuals, sometimes like you will see, kind of have to start to get a feeling that collectively masseter start to create a bit of an X, which is kind of what it does, really. So, you know, which helps to pull the jaw in every which way, really. So these two kind of more or less cross together as a bit of an X there. Now, in certain individuals, you can see a bit of a deeper part kind of stick out here in the front a little bit. I've seen kind of cases like that. We don't see that often, but from time to time, you will see a little portion there of masseter. And what's interesting about the superficial part as well, as you can see, is that it has a lot of little sections that all more or less go at different angles. And so we refer to that as a muscle that is multi-pennate. And there are others that are multi-pennate inside of the body. There is also the deltoid, the medial deltoid, which if we ever talk about anatomy of the body, we'll certainly get to that at some point, which also has a tendency to create like these kind of striations or these kind of sections that all collectively kind of form these kind of like weird, sort of very organic shape there. And so we can see that here on masseter. And sometimes you will be able to see individual striations or just individual heads of masseter on certain individuals. The thing about masseter is that it is extremely large. It's a very, very thick muscle. So if someone doesn't have a lot of facial fat, you usually can really appreciate the shape of masseter really, really clearly. Let's find a few examples of that. So this particular lady has a bit too much buccal fat, so it's kind of hard to see the front border of masseter. But let's find one that has at rest a masseter that is very, very clearly defined. It also helps if you are looking for masseter, which is right here. It also helps to look at a head from this particular angle. I really like that because you can really start to see clearly where is the front border of masseter on certain individuals. And let's find an example here that is very, very obvious of the masseter. Let's just find an example here. Let's go through these different heads. Yeah, take a look at this one here. See, so this particular gentleman does not have a lot of facial fat. And so we're starting to get a lot of cavities here on the front here on the midface, which allows us to really clearly see just how incredibly volumetric, I suppose, masseter can really, really get, you know? And obviously it becomes even more obvious when we have someone who is clenching their jaw there. So let's look at that again. Let's bring the jaw clencher here. So, okay, let's go through a few of these. Let's look at how masseter changes. Yeah, you can see on this open jaw, see like all of this here, this huge mass here, all of that is masseter. And so the masseter is clearly visible from front too, you know, like it's not a muscle that's just on the side. since it pretty much fills this whole space here. Now, on this particular individual, there is also a bit of fat there, but for the most part, when you look at someone from front view, like this whole zone here, this whole thickness, if you will, is usually pretty much all because of masseter, and you can often see that very clearly on certain individuals that don't necessarily have a lot of facial fat. See, like this whole mass here, this extends as far out, really for the only reason that masseter is there. See here, this little part here. So we are at the jaw clencher right now. See that little part here? That's kind of one of those little bulbous sections of a masseter that kind of appear as we are clenching the jaw there. So if I rotate towards the back, you can also kind of appreciate just a little bit the fact that, see, like here, so when the jaw is a bit more at rest, this looks like a unified mass, but the moment that the jaw is clenching, we can actually really start to see like a bit of a valley here, right? There's kind of a ridge here that kind of runs down the side there. And that is because of masseter, once more, and the striation and the multi-pennant nature of it. So we have masseter here, we have masseter here. Now this here, this is a little bump that you will see on certain individuals from time to time. There's just a little bump here. That kind of sticks out a little bit there. And the thing that's also interesting about masseter, by the way, this image is, if you look at it from like that, with the cheeks that are pulled inward, it almost looks like a bird or something with like a little beak there. It's kind of poking on the front. I love this particular scan. But yeah, what's also interesting about this particular one is, once more, we can appreciate the fact that like the jaws are getting, like the cheeks are getting sucked in, but they can only get sucked in to the point where masseter starts, really. So we can once more clearly appreciate, see the bottom, the front border here, if you will, the front plane change that happens at the front border of the masseter. Yeah, so it's a pretty crazy muscle. Now, it's not the only thing that we have in this particular zone. So if you look at masseter, the thing is that if we go back here, so we have the ear that's about, let me draw here on top of this. So the ear is about here, so it's a bit smaller than that. So it's about, I don't know, about big like this or so, right? I'm terrible at drawing, but essentially you do have the ear in there somewhere. So we have the tragus here. Yeah, I'm just not good at drawing ears, so I'm not gonna start. I'm much better at sculpting them. It's like I'm able to sculpt an ear, but somehow I'm not able to draw one. But so this whole cavity here, that is kind of like, this is the border of the ear, if you will. And so you can kind of see where the back border is of the superficial portion of masseter. And so we get this kind of gap here. There's like a bit of a gap there. There's a bit of a volume here, just kind of a bit of a space. And in certain individuals, this will create a slight depression that is visible, but on other individuals, it will not be. This will actually look completely flat and more or less on the same plane as the masseter there. So this cavity here is actually filled by something that we call the parotid gland. Just like this. So we can see here, we have the back border. I mean, it's a drawing, so I suspect this should actually be closer here. But so we have the back border here of the superficial portion of masseter. And behind that, as you can see, there's this gland here that actually fills the space between the back of masseter and the ear. Now, when you look at this, you're like, yeah, I mean, it's just like, it doesn't look like it's too big, right? It's just like a very flat kind of gland. It doesn't seem like it has a lot of volume, you know, like it's not all that interesting. And you would be wrong. Take a look at this. This is a cut through. This is a horizontal cut through the face. But so the parotid gland, take a look at how incredibly large this is. it's super large, you know, and the back of it, or rather the I suppose the side of it, the most lateral portion of it is more or less continuous here with the masseter, which for your reference, this is the superficial portion and this would be the deeper portion. But yeah, so this gland can get really, really big on certain individuals. Here's a dissection that clearly shows the parotid gland. You can see here. Looks like someone scrambled some eggs and maybe melted a bit of cheese on top of it. It's noon. I hope no one's eating right now. At least it's noon here. Yeah, parotid gland. Quite large, actually. So that helps to really smooth out this particular zone here that is behind masseter and fills in the gap between masseter and the ear there. Now, there's some interesting plane changes happening with masseter that you kind of have to be aware of. It's not actually something that is flat. So first of all, we do have this this forward plane, if you will, this forward plane change that is very visible in people who have a low amount of buccal fat, you know, as this individual does. You can see clearly here that there is a bit of a ridge, you know, like we can clearly see where the volume is of masseter here on the back. But this particular individual doesn't have the biggest parotid gland, I suppose. And this is kind of what's interesting about masseter if we take a look at the shape of it. If I cut here through and I just cut out a cross section, this is something that I really want you guys to observe. If we look at the cross section here, so if I bring back the model, perhaps we can look at it again just to have a bit of a reference of where we are. Yeah. See how round this is, and this whole portion here that is on the back there of the masseter, it really recedes gradually towards the back, and within the the shape seems to become narrower and narrower as we are going back there. So some people do masseter as like a completely flat plane that sort of just cuts through the whole side of the face there, and that's kind of a mistake there. Like the high point, if you will, the point that sticks out the most of masseter is at about this particular height. I really should kill the quick save because this is going to take forever once more. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. But I just wanted to point that out. Like, I really want you guys to really think of masseter and really try to observe masseter under different angles, because you'll see that the there's a bit of a recession or a narrowing, I suppose, once we have reached the midpoint of masseter towards the back. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say on that. Let's move on. I think I'm already really behind my own schedule. Oh God. We'll see how long this class goes. It's probably good. Well, I mean, so far, like, we've had classes that were all pretty much like 4-hour long. So I don't think that this one's going to be any exception, really. All right, let's move on. So the jaw itself, we have something that we call the Temporomandibular Joint, which is a fancy name just for the actual jaw itself, really, and the joint that connects the mandible to the rest of the skull there. So the Temporomandibular Joint. Just like that here, Temporomandibular Joint. So there's a lot that kind of happens there. You can see here also, there are muscles we haven't talked about. We won't really talk about them too much because they don't really create any surface shape because they are inside of the jaw there. You know, like we have the masseter sitting on the outside of the ramus of the mandible, and on the inside that more or less mimics or is a more or less symmetrical to the masseter on the outside. On the inside of the jaw, you have something that we call the pterygoid, which I believe actually I have an image of that. Let me just fast forward through this and come back. Do I have it here? No, I guess I don't, unless it's this one here. And there it is. Yeah, so this is the medial pterygoid, which more or less mimics the shape and position of masseter on the outside. So that also helps to close the jaw. But you know, obviously, since it's within the mouth there, we don't really see it there. But what is interesting here is that there are other pieces of pterygoid that connect to the topmost border here of the ramus of the mandible. And so we have a muscle called the lateral pterygoid, whose job it is to open the jaw, really. So there's not a lot of muscles that help to open the jaw. I think it's by far the most important one, the lateral pterygoid, which is here. It's this one here. So this one. Well, I guess two portions of it. So the lateral pterygoid that you don't see from the outside is the muscle that helps to open the jaw. So you can kind of see them here. And so not a lot of people necessarily know what the jaw does when it actually opens. And it's interesting to talk about it because if you've never really thought about how the jaw opens, it's easy to be wrong with that. You know, like it's easy to think of the jaw as a kind of hinge that kind of has, you know, this kind of shape. And then there's a bit of a pivot here, you know, like we kind of look at, okay, so the joint is there, you know, so the jaw probably rotates like this towards the back, right? Like you can kind of think that that's kind of what happens, but there's no space for it to do that. The jaw simply cannot do that. Why? Because here we have something called the sternocleidomastoid as a muscle. You know, we saw that there's a gland here. There's like a whole bunch of stuff behind the jaw that makes it so that the jaw can simply cannot move further back. There's no space for it. It's impossible to do so. So this is something that not a lot of people do, you know? And then you see this here and you're like, well, what the hell is there, this muscle right here pulling on the jaw? How does that make any sense? So when the jaw opens, what happens to the jaw is that the jaw actually slides forward. This is really weird, but when you're opening the jaw has a tendency more to go forward than to go backward, really. And the point of rotation of the jaw is not actually here. This is not where the jaw rotates. The jaw rotates at about this point right here or so. Now, this isn't an actual joint. This is more or less just something you can feel for yourself, you know? So why don't you all do that right now? Why don't you all touch yourselves? Why don't you touch like the corner here of the angle of the jaw and just open your jaw and see if this point moves? Because it probably won't. Let me go ahead here and switch my screen over. I got this fancy new scene in OBS for this particular reason, right? So I guess, hey, why not? Let's go all the way since we're there. Yeah, so if you take a look at my jaw, essentially as I open my jaw, see, so there is a bit of this pulling backward a little bit, but not a lot, right? It's like the rotation more or less happens at this point right here. And you can see here the top part of the jaw. Look at the ramus and see how the ramus really projects forward when you open the jaw. So obviously, I encourage you guys to try this for yourself. I do encourage you guys to try this for yourself, of course. Let me just put my headphones back on. But what happens then is that the temporomandibular joint actually projects forward as we open the jaw. So let me switch back my screen. So the temporomandibular joint actually projects forward, which is actually really crazy. So the jaw goes forward like that when you open it. And so what happens to this whole mass here? This whole mass also gets projected forward. That's weird, right? That's not what you would expect it to do. So in a way, the jaw kind of dislocates itself. Now, this whole image, which is kind of incomprehensible, is actually a video that I found that really shows the actual temporomandibular joint in action. Let's take a look at that. Take a look at that. So what you're seeing here, this is actually part of the mandible. This is the whole temporal mandibular joint there. And you can see how the jaw opens, how this little bony section here actually slides forward. It's kind of crazy, right? And you can see like everything that's kind of happening to the tissues there at the same time. It's so weird to look at, and yet so fascinating. But yeah, so what I want you guys to really observe about this is that as the jaw opens, this part here projects forward, and look at what happens in this particular zone here. See how like all the tissues in this particular zone seem to get compressed and also pushed forward? See that? Let's have it one more time because this is really cool to look at. This will make for a juicy YouTube video, I'm sure, if this ever makes its way to YouTube. So yeah, so that's kind of crazy, right? Like how the jaw opens. And this is more or less the reason why this happens. As the jaw opens, because what we call the coronoid process of the mandible, so the coronoid process being, there's kind of two bumps really on the top of the mandible. Let's just go back and take a look at that. No, this isn't the best image. Actually, we have a skull in ZBrush. Why don't we use that? So what we call the coronoid process is this little portion here. And as the jaw opens, this projects forward. So let's rotate the jaw a little bit, right? So we start from here, and then we kind of more or less just do a rotation on this. So as this rotates, see, this kind of thing happens. And so the coronoid process pushes forward as the jaw opens, which has the consequence of doing this as people open their jaws. So for someone who's relatively lean, so we can really clearly see all the tissues in action there. As the jaw open, well, on this one's not as obvious, but I really like the one that I had here, so let's go back to this one. See how this becomes thicker here because the coronoid process is actually projecting forward. And at the same time, this happens here. There's this kind of mass here that forms, you know? And so at first glance, you could think like, okay, well, this is probably part of temporalis, right? I mean, this looks like we're in the zone of temporalis. This has to be temporalis, but it doesn't make sense because temporalis is actually stretched. When you open the jaw, temporalis stretches, it does not compress, of course. So this cannot be temporalis simply becoming bigger. So what is this exactly? Well, the first clue is that we can see a bit of a ridge that kind of forms right here. And this ridge here is actually the zygomatic arch that we can see. And because she has a lot of facial fat in that particular zone, we simply cannot see the zygomatic arch when she's at rest. But the moment that she opens her mouth, we start to get a bulge here. And we get a bulge here. This is actually fat that is right on top of temporalis. This is actually fat that is inside of the zygomatic space, if you will, inside the zygomatic cavity there, that, you know, usually fills up and smooths out this particular zone here. This whole fat gets compressed, gets squished towards the top because of the ramus projecting forward of the mandible. And by consequence, we have a bulge here that forms because the fat is kind of just pushing towards the outside. Anyway, I thought it was fascinating. So the first muscle of the neck that is important to know is the sternocleidomastoid. So this whole thing here, it's quite a mouthful to pronounce. I'm quite proud because I think last time that we had a class, I wrote it down without making a mistake, which is a feat in and of itself. So the sternocleidomastoid, or what I like to call just the SCM, which is a bit easier to remember there. So the sternocleidomastoid starts from the mastoid process that we have talked about last week. which is certainly where the mastoid comes there. And the sternocleido simply means sternum and clavicle. So it is a muscle that has two heads that insert into, one inserts into the sternum and one inserts into the clavicle there. So we can see here the sternal portion, and here's the clavicular portion. Now from this angle here, again, this is a 2D picture, it's even a drawing, so we can't really get a really nice appreciation for the shape and the angles and all that's kind of going on there. But at least this kind of gives us a pretty good idea of where it actually is. From this particular reference here, it's a bit easier to appreciate how there is a separation towards the insertion of sternocleidomastoid. You really start to have a separation that is visible between the clavicular head and the sternal head, or rather the sternal head and the clavicular head. You can start to see a bit of that separation there, and you start to get this kind of triangular kind of fossa here. It kind of gets created between the two portions of sternocleidomastoid. And also, you can appreciate on this particular drawing here how there's a very nice circular nature to the tendinous part of the sternal head of sternocleidomastoid, and how this portion here is actually a lot flatter there, and it's a bit deeper too within the skin. So older individuals are good to study underlying anatomy because the skin becomes thinner, and therefore we start to see the muscles a bit more. So this is a great reference to study sternocleidomastoid. And yeah, so we can see how voluminous sternocleidomastoid can really get. But we can also see how it is really one and the same here. It's just the two heads more or less form a unified body at the top part, but we can clearly trace the shape of it and see that it really kind of gradually expands towards the bottom. And look at this triangular fossa here. Take a look at that. It's so deep on this one. So deep. Now, on younger individuals, it's not as deep as this, but we can observe everything here. We can also observe the nice kind of circular nature to the tendinous part of the sternal head. And this seems relatively voluminous too, but on a lot of people, this will be mostly flat here. This will look a lot flatter there. But yeah, like we can really appreciate all the shapes here that sternocleidomastoid creates. Let's go through a few different references because there is more to be said on sternocleidomastoid than that. Because I see a lot of mistakes when I look at student work. I see a lot of mistakes when it comes to this particular muscle there, because people don't quite observe enough the shape that it really has. So first of all, we can observe here again the slightly more cylindrical portion here of the sternal head that really goes down and inserts into the sternum there. You know, like from here you could think that it inserts into the head of the clavicle, but it really doesn't. It really continues all the way down to the sternum here. But also the thing that I find fascinating about sternocleidomastoid, and where I think people usually get it wrong, is with the angle of it and where the voluminous portion of it is. All right, take a look at this here. Take a look at this head here. So I see a lot of students who don't give enough attention to how head and how shoulders look from profile. I see a lot of students who don't pay enough attention to that. What they have a tendency to do, something that looks like this. People have a tendency to do something like this. Like if I was kind of doing a student work here, like what I see more often than not is a neck that looks like this. I kind of see necks like that. Like I see this so much in student work because people are pretty good at observing what a face looks like from front, but they don't spend enough time at really observe what a head looks like from side. And I suspect that a lot of that is also a problem of references, you know? Like there's way too many people who, when they want to sculpt a head and they want to kind of study anatomy, they're like, okay, I'll just go and I'll Google like random images of like an actor or an actress, and they'll be like, okay, let's do, I don't know, Tom Cruise, because for some reason I have him in my head right now. No particular reason. There's some really interesting things about his face, by the way, in terms of facial symmetry, we've never really talked about. But you know, like people have tendency to just Google pictures like that, right? And you know, like these are typical random pictures that you would get of someone that you're sculpting. And so people get all these pictures, and either the neck is completely occluded because the subject is wearing clothes, so you don't really see what's going on there, or people kind of look at pictures and they're kind of like, oh, okay, so I guess sternocleidomastoid kind of looks like it's kind of going forward a little bit, you know, it's kind of at a diagonal forward or something. But you know, none of these pictures you really give you like a really good appreciation of what the particular neck should look like from side, really. There's just not enough information for that. So what people have tendency to do is necks that kind of look like this, you know. They kind of know that sternocleidomastoid has a bit of an angle forward like this, and it does. But people do necks like these, like way, way, way too much when it comes time to sculpt. And so what I really want you guys to really remember about sternocleidomastoid is that, yes, sternocleidomastoid does go diagonally forward. But that's in terms of anatomy. What I want you guys to think of is in terms of shape. And I want you guys to start to observe shape as opposed to observe anatomy in this particular case. And what happens when we observe shape of sternocleidomastoid? It's actually almost vertical. It's almost vertical. Like the neck isn't straight. It's certainly not projecting forward. The neck is actually receding back, as you can see. And so because of that, you know, here's the head of the clavicle. Sternocleidomastoid really doesn't have to angle itself forward too much, you know. It's very, very, very vertical on a lot of people. But it's also what's vertical is the shape of it too, you know. Like if we forget about the anatomy and we simply observe the shape that it has, we can clearly see how there is a very cylindrical portion to it. It's very visible here. That is practically on the vertical axis. Not quite, it's a few degrees off, but it's very, very close. But sternocleidomastoid does project forward at a steeper angle. And the reason is because, as you can see, the front portion here, if you will, the front part, you know, like this is where the border actually is. The front part, essentially the sternal head of sternocleidomastoid, is cylindrical here at the tendinous zone, but the muscle part of it is actually very, very flat, as you can see. So sternocleidomastoid, the front part of it is very, very flat. And as a consequence, you know, you don't really see it here. In fact, most of the mass that you see is the one that connects down to the clavicle. That's mostly where the mass is, really. Unless it's activated, then that's going to create something else there, right? But yeah, like you can really observe how there's a very, very nice and flat plane like this, as opposed to like a big bulbous mass that kind of projects forward. Anyway, that's what I want to say for sternocleidomastoid. Please be careful in really observing it properly if you are sculpting a head, because it is one of the most common mistakes that I see on student heads. And then I'll just go through these very, very, very quick because we are a bit behind schedule here. I never intended to talk about these in great detail anyway, because they're not really related to the face there, but just to complete the information on the neck, it's kind of interesting to simply mention them. So, you know, I'm sure we'll come back on those if we talk about anatomy of the shoulders and the body at some point in greater detail. But so what else do we have to complete the picture of the neck that we have? Other muscles that are very important. We have the trapezius here on the back. Now, I'm sure anyone who's studied anatomy at this point knows what trapezius is, so it's probably not necessary for me to spend too much time on it. But it is essentially the back here. It is the whole muscle here that fills up the back. And we've talked about this last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure when, but we did talk about this before. You know, the fact that the mastoid process projects outward from the skull means that the trapezius is further inward the neck than the sternocleidomastoid is, and therefore you can see here the shape of trapezius. And you can clearly see the front border of it. Especially on someone who's very lean, of course, as always. Although on certain individuals, the neck can become so fine that it starts to become hard to really see the back portion, I suppose, of sternocleidomastoid, where that muscle ends and where trapezius begins. But yeah, in the interest of time, I won't talk too much more about trapezius. Makes more sense to talk about it in the context of talking about the scapula as opposed to talk about the face. So I won't say much more about it. But I do want you, at least you guys, to observe that I still haven't killed the autosave there. Oh. I simply want you guys to observe the fact that trapezius does fill up the back of the neck there, and that on the front portion of the neck, or rather in between sternocleidomastoid and trapezius, there are other muscles too that sometimes create shape. It's not important to know them too much because they don't create too much shape, but once in a while you will actually see them. And those muscles are, one is what we call the scalenes, and on top of that there's something that we called levator scapula. And let me just, in the interest of being clear, let me at the very least point out where they are and where their shape is a little bit. So you can see here, the scalenes is a group of different muscles. There's a few of them. I believe there's 3, but there could be 2. Now I'm not actually sure about how many of those there is. But you can easily, clearly see 2 of the scalenes here. And on the back here, this is what we call levator scapula. Now, there is more stuff here. There's something here that we call splenius capitis, and there's other stuff too. But in the interest of brevity, I don't want to dissect these things a bit further than that. I simply want you guys to really observe these 3 different bodies. So the 2 bodies here of scalene and the 3rd body of levator scapula. Because on certain individuals, they are visible. Like this woman here shows us levator scapula right here. You can see how it kind of creates an X with sternocleidomastoid. But it is under, so you don't really see its shape too much. But in this particular instance, we can see a little bit of levator scapula right here. And we can also kind of see a little bit. So if we do dissect this completely, right? So we have here, from here to here, we have sternocleidomastoid. We have levator scapula in the back. And then here we can kind of see a little bit of scalenes that connect to the ribs, actually. So they originate on the ribs, on the 1st and 2nd rib. But yeah, for most people, you won't necessarily be able to really observe them, especially if someone is young or isn't really forcing there, you know. Can't really see too much there. You can see that there's a bit of a mass here, you know. On certain individuals, this will look more like a cavity. Here we can see a little bit. One of the muscles there towards the back. You know, you pretty much have to spot 2 heads. Like the first heads that you have are the heads of sternocleidomastoid, and any bump behind that is likely to be the scalenes. You know, we can see a very, very fine imprint of one of the scalenes right here. Take a look at this one here. This one's a bit crazy, right? You can clearly see where levator scapula is right here. And again, we can see very fine imprints of the scalenes. And we can also kind of spot here the front border here of trapezius, since trapezius sits on top of levator scapula. And the last one I haven't talked about the neck that is important to know is the platysma. It's a really crazy muscle, actually, that extends all the way down from the sternum and even further down, I believe. I think there's even part of it that is on top of pectoralis, actually, if I remember correctly. So platysma is this muscle that you have right here. It's kind of like, it's a very, very thin sheet of muscle. It's very wide, it's very large. It's very, very thin. And if you're not forcing it, you won't really be able to see it. But once you do force platysma, it becomes very, very obvious. So the role of platysma is more or less just to do this here, you know? Like, why don't I serve as a model for you guys since I got this nice little screen right here? See? You can even see a bit of levator scapula in the back, actually, depending on the angle. See all these small striations? Those are all caused by platysma. It's the little striations that kind of happen as you do this kind of expression. So it looks like that, and it kind of looks like this. So the thing that's interesting about platysma is that it creates these very organic striations when it is forced. You can see how it's pulling really the corner of the mouth there. It creates all these like very organic striations, but what's particularly interesting about platysma is that you will often see the back border here of platysma, the back of the sheet, will usually be a bit more cylindrical, a bit more tubular. So you can usually easily spot where the back of platysma is. But it covers pretty much the whole neck.